not just East Gaza, but Lebanon as well. And then, quite critically, he sees this very bloody ongoing war, nearly 3 years now, between Russia and Ukraine, in Ukraine, with huge casualties, and realizes the implications for European security. And I think perfectly reasonably, as he has said in the past, both during the presidential campaign and when he was last the US president, he believes that Europe should take a greater share of responsibility and the financial burden for its own security. So consequently, he's upped the ante quite dramatically by saying that European countries should think about spending 5% of GDP on defence. Now, critics might say, well, he's just plucked that figure out of the air. It's totally unachievable. But in fact, if you look back in history, in the late 1980s, the last decade, last years of the Cold War, that was the level of GDP spending that was going on defence. And that bought us a sufficient level of nuclear and conventional deterrence that prevented the Cold War from ever going hot. So he's not wrong to talk about 5%. He's not wrong to talk about Europe needing to take a greater share. The challenge for our government, frankly, is are they more afraid of what Donald Trump might do in terms of slapping tariffs on us, more afraid of him than they are of Vladimir Putin, frankly, who is an proven aggressor. And frankly, who knows where he's going to go next on his own agenda.
In the UK, if we're going to take Donald Trump's desired increase to 5%, we're currently about 2.3%, that would basically mean, with some sort of back of the envelope sums, 70 to 80 billion pounds more, or 90 to 100 billion dollars in cash terms. What does that actually get you? What difference would that make to the British Army in this example?
Well, it would make a tremendous difference, self-evidently. I think what I would say, of course, is that if our government was ever minded to commit to 5% of GDP on defence, it would perfectly reasonably have to put it out in a time frame of, say, by 2030 or 2035, we'll raise defence spending to that kind of level. Until Donald Trump had talked about 5%, I and others had been talking about 3 or 3.5%, which seemed a realistic objective over and above the 2.5%, which itself, given inflation and over normal inflation, which is defence inflation, frankly would have meant the defence budget in real terms would have been still declining. So even going to 2.5% is only an exercise in filling in the potholes, if you like. So with that preamble, to answer your question, well, the first thing we've absolutely got to do from the land forces point of view is to accelerate replenishing our own arms and ammunition supplies, given that we have gifted a tremendous amount of arms and ammunition to Ukraine. Specifically, we gave them 32 AS-90 155mm self-propelled artillery guns. That was most of our fleet, and most of the ammunition that was required. So we need to accelerate the replacement artillery systems. We need to place orders with industry quickly for more 155mm ammunition and a whole range of other ammunitions, not the least of which is the NLAW anti-tank weapons, which we gave to Ukraine in copious quantities in 2022. Very effectively they were too. And then you've got to look at other elements which the war in Ukraine has shown are increasingly important. That is drones and drone technology, counter-drone technology, information systems that can join up what the sensors can see and what the shooters can do. So there are many areas of developing technology, both in terms of weaponry and communications and surveillance equipment, that frankly we haven't got, but we need. And then you go outside the land domain, into the maritime and the air domain. Well, we've got the 2 aircraft carriers with their F-35 aircraft. We have not bought anything like the number that we originally said that we would buy. We probably need to double at least the number of F-35s that we buy. There is the new GCAP system, the sort of the next generation of fast jets. That's hugely expensive. And then you look at the Royal Navy and ask the question, do we have enough destroyers and frigates and submarines, given we're an island nation and 95% of our trade comes through the sea lanes of the world? So whichever way you look at it, both on land, in the air, and at sea, under the sea, in space and in cyberspace, there are huge shopping bills or shopping lists of things that need to be funded.
When you look at stats from NATO, the British, French, and German military budgets, on the current estimates, combined are more than Russia's defence budget, even with the enhanced spending that it's announced. That's before you factor in all the other NATO countries, some of whom spend much more of GDP, and of course the enormous US defence budget. Is this actually about the hard fighting power of NATO, or is it more about sort of political mindsets and re-gearing how our governments think about defence?
Well, if one's talking about political mindsets, one's sort of talking about diplomacy, really. And it was Theodore Roosevelt who said the big thing about diplomacy in these conflict type situations is to speak softly carrying a big stick. Now, currently, we're speaking quite loudly with a very small stick. And without sidetracking myself, if you go back to the late 1930s, when we failed to either appease or deter Hitler, at Munich, Neville Chamberlain was only carrying an umbrella, no kind of big stick at all. So the point behind what I'm really saying is that the main purpose of building up our military capability is so that it says to Vladimir Putin, the West, yes, the Americans, but the European countries are now that capable that if I try something, I will not succeed. In other words, what we're spending is to deter war. We're not spending to meet the disastrous cost of fighting a war. And again, if I can just dwell on three other figures. In 1935, we were spending just less than 3% of GDP on defence. We failed to either deter or appease Hitler. In 1939, when the war broke out, that shot up from 3% to 19%. And in 1940, when we were fighting for our very survival, it was 46%. That is the disastrous cost of fighting a war. How much better to move towards spending 5%, as we did in the Cold War days, to prevent the Cold War becoming hot, and currently to deter further aggression from Vladimir Putin.
And where do you think we are at the moment? Do you think that, I'm sure that we could always spend more on defence and could always beef up that deterrent. Are we at a point now where Vladimir Putin is sufficiently deterred to, say, look towards the Baltic states? That seems to be where a lot of defence analysts are particularly worried, and indeed the countries themselves are worried that he might look next after Ukraine.
Well, we are doing what we can to support those countries that have a common border with Russia. We, the UK, have a forward battle group in Estonia, and the rest of its brigade, 2 or 3 other battle groups, are standing behind those, ready to reinforce. We've talked about much the same in Poland as well. But if I'm absolutely honest, once we've done those things and meeting the other commitments we've got of a minor nature around the world, we haven't got an awful lot left in the locker. Now, if there should be a negotiated settlement or negotiated ceasefire, which I think is probably the most we could hope for this year in Ukraine, it would almost certainly need an international monitoring force to stand between the Russians and the Ukrainians to maintain that ceasefire. Now, there's a 700-kilometre frontage. Now, let's just say the UK felt it should take part in that, which it should. We might say, well, we'll take up responsibility for 100 kilometres. That, in my judgment, would need 5,000 to 10,000 soldiers, properly equipped and armed and supplied to do that for 6 months. And then the next 6 months and the next 6 months. So we need another group of soldiers to do those subsequent 6 months. We haven't got them. We have reduced. I mean, when I was Chief of General Staff, we were fighting simultaneous operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. We could just do that from a regular force of 102,000 and reservists to 30,000. Well, we're now down to around about 72,000 regular and not much over 20,000 reserves. So we have taken too many peace dividends since the end of the Cold War. Successive governments of both colour have done this, and we have reached the point where we have not got the capability that we ought to have to play our role as a leading member of NATO in Europe. And remember, Britain is one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. We've got wider international responsibilities.
So if the UK, with those wider international responsibilities, and it's a key security ally of the US, not least because of NATO, but more broadly, Five Eyes and so on, if the UK is apparently going to sort of defy Donald Trump on this push for 5%, does that in effect give some top cover for other NATO allies to do the same? Does that kind of have a ripple effect across NATO?
Well, the UK, going back to David Cameron's time as Prime Minister, when we were spending less than 2% of GDP, we quite quickly, before the 2014 NATO summit, which was hosted in the UK, committed to 2%. And that might have been encouragement from Donald Trump as well, or at least the pressure from America. A number of other countries have followed suit and have gone to 2%. Now we're talking about 2.5%, but now we're talking about not doing it till 2032. Hitherto, the UK has set an example, but if we set our face against increasing our defence budget to just that little increase to 2.5%, but not for 7 years, we're setting an extraordinarily bad example that others might choose to follow. If they say, well, if the UK is not going to do it, but we're not going to do it, Uncle Sam, you'll have to continue to bail us out. It does come back to the question that I mused on 5-10 minutes ago. Is Keir Starmer more afraid of what Donald Trump could do to us than what Vladimir Putin could do to us? And I fear that he's willing to take a risk on Vladimir Putin. Well, yeah, he's got a choice to make. Is he going to be a Chamberlain or is he going to be a Churchill?
And if spending is not increased at all, presumably the end goal of this, if Trump does get his 5% increases, is that the US is carrying less of the burden. It's currently sort of 65-70% of NATO's whole defence budget is the US defence budget. What would Trump do ultimately? Is he stepping back from NATO? Is he completely leaving it entirely? Can NATO survive if it's without the US? What is a realistic sort of prospect for the future of NATO if Trump doesn't get what he wants?
Whatever Trump may have said in the past, in the recent past and the distant past, about NATO, I don't believe that he would ever take the United States out of NATO. Certainly, European member states of NATO would work extremely hard to make sure that the United States stayed within NATO, not the least of which for the nuclear umbrella, which is largely provided by the US. Yes, okay, the British and the French have a nuclear deterrent, but not of the scale of the United States. So there is the nuclear umbrella aspect. But I think also history shows that when Europe gets itself in a muddle, as it did in 1914 and in 1939, it's not been resolved until the United States effectively comes in and helps out. And that has been the case during the Second World War, continued on through the Cold War. And I think it's very much in our interests, and I think the United States' interest, for the United States to stay appropriately engaged in Europe. However, the Europeans must take a great degree of the burden sharing, greater proportion of the burden sharing. And that's what Trump is nudging us, imploring us, you could almost say bullying us to do. And he's not right as far, he's not wrong as far as that's concerned.
And just to look across the rest of NATO briefly, where do you see the chips falling in that sort of, well, it's the classic guns versus butter debate of what do you spend your fairly limited budgets on in Europe? You've got countries like Estonia, Poland, particularly Poland spending more than 4% of GDP, then countries like Spain spending less than 1.5%. Do you think that is going to shift particularly dramatically by 2030, by the end of the Trump presidency? Or do you think this sort of inequity, this lack of parity is going to continue beyond Donald Trump?
Well, I think the inequity that you refer to is a function of geography. It's no surprise that Poland is spending 4.1% of GDP on defence because it has a long common border with Russia. Spain is a long way away and believes that it can probably get by on what it is currently spending, and you probably can't fault that logic in many ways. But it does come down to all European governments and our own. The business of government is to choose. The business of government is to set priorities. And this, I think, is the problem that Rachel Reeves has and the Prime Minister's got, to know where they should be spending our scarce resources. Yes, the British government talks about growth as being really important. And if they can generate some meaningful growth, then the pie, if you like, is bigger. And therefore the slice that can go to defence can itself be bigger. But there are some difficult choices to be made within it. It was very interesting last week. The House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee published a report about health-related benefits, which are currently at around about £64.7 billion, up sharply since the pandemic, and projected to rise to £100 billion by 2030. Now, if policy was changed to bear down on health-related benefits and kept it at, say, the current level, then that potential increase that could have gone to 100 billion, that actually would have made up the 5% of GDP on defence. So the government has got choices to make, looking across the whole spectrum, from health to social care to education to transport to other infrastructure projects, and has to make its decisions on where it's going to spend its money. And you know what I'm going to say next. We all know that the first duty of government is to protect the security of the nation. And at 2.3%, are we doing that? No, I don't think we are.
And I'm going to, for a final question, feed you into a dangerous game here, predicting Donald Trump and predicting the future with Donald Trump. He says he wants 5% of GDP spending on defence. The US currently is only at 3.4%, more than a lot of NATO countries, but not at 5%. Do you think Donald Trump is going to increase that spending, or is this all a sort of negotiating chip, bargaining chip with his allies?
Well, I think the messages coming out of the White House in the last few days are that he is planning to increase United States defence expenditure. I think the responsibilities that the United Nations have as, frankly, the world's only major military superpower. I know the Chinese are coming on, but they haven't got there by quite some measure yet. The responsibilities that the United States have got, and even the United States military is underfunded. I think we will see Trump increasing the proportion of US GDP that goes into defence. Whether it gets up to 5%, we'll wait and see. Which is why probably a lot of European countries are saying, yeah, okay, you're around about 3.5. Well, the most we might consider is 3.5, and I've already talked about, I think, and others think that 3.5 is about where we should be. 5%, I've talked about that as well. That was the level we were spending in the Cold War. So it's got historic precedent for that. But I think to move beyond 2.5 to 3.5% to an agreed timetable, somewhere between 2030 and 2035, is the right thing to do. It takes time to ramp up defence spending and to use the money sensibly. But we really ought to have that commitment so that defence planners and programmers in the Ministry of Defence can make their plans and sensibly grow the forces. Industry can have contracts placed. You can't just turn these things on overnight unless you're going to buy off the shelf from Uncle Sam. There is a major issue about wanting to sustain and support the British defence industrial base, and that's important too. So it needs to be a commitment to a larger defence spend by a certain time, and then we can plan and programme.
Richard, thank you.